Though of appearing perfect and happy, many young people choose to hide and suppress their unhappy thoughts and feelings. Do you agree with this, and why? And how do you think this suppression affects their emotional health?
That's a deeper question for me because
Uh-huh.
of just because specifically your question is relying to younger individuals. We'll say the teenager. So
Uh,
that's
like not teenage or even young adults, like up to the age of like 30, 35. That's
oh
my age.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I think seeing the work, some of the work that I do, I work with a lot of what I call milestones. All
Okay.
right. So how media is going to affect a 2-year-old can be very different from the 14-year-old who's developing the back of the brain and hasn't had the prefrontal cortex developed yet. Because this is all emotion centered. And so
Hmm.
that's why teenagers are so emotionally, and this part here, which is our logic and reasoning, that's why teenagers are super impulsive. So, whereas a 30-year-old, this part here, the tectonic plates have all fused, this is how I am, this is how I've been developed. And so I'm able to now work towards maintaining my emotion center and my thought processing center to maybe go, you know what, I think jumping off the bridge, into the water down below might not be a good idea. Whereas to the teenager, hey, that was a cool video I saw on YouTube. Let's do it. And next thing
Hmm.
you know, they've just made the worst decision of their life because they didn't see the rocks at the bottom of the water.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fair. So, but here I was talking about your feelings, your unhappy thoughts and feelings, like in a bid to appear happy online or even among friends. Like, what sort of effect does this have on their emotional state?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say from an emotional state, I
Yeah.
think you nailed it with your one word,
Mm-hmm.
happiness. The
Mm-hmm.
issue with happiness is a lot of, depending what research you do in that area, a lot of individuals, the one I like to pick on, I think I mentioned to you as well, I sent you a link, was Dr. Sue or Susan Johnson. All right.
Yes.
And I would say, based on the research and materials that she even has done, the issues with that is that it leads to a very surface secondary emotion. Happiness is viewed by many as a secondary emotion, whereas a primary emotion is joy. So, an example would be, I don't know, the birth of a child. It's like, wow, new person, new life. I'm the dad. Wow, I have such joy in my heart for this child. I will do everything I can to the best of my ability, knowing I'm going to make mistakes, but to the best of my ability, I have such joy for my child. And that's lasting, hopefully lasting throughout till they become, even through the crazy teenage years, to an adult and so forth. Happiness is oh man, Mexico was so awesome, man. I loved it. And now I got back last Friday and oh my gosh, it's so cold. Man, I'm so miserable. This sucks. Well, happiness is fleeting. It's a secondary emotion. So it's a fleeting emotion. Social media in general, is a very happy place to be in for secondary emotions, but it doesn't build upon primary root emotions like joy. So that's
Yeah.
a concern of mine.
Yes. That's very good insight. Yeah. With this suppression also comes the fear of being vulnerable because young people know that they would be evaluated and judged for their social media activities. Do you think this causes young people to become even more careful and thus more sheltered in their actual lives as well as online lives?
I think part of that depends on their development.
Uh huh.
Because if they're still developing, as I mentioned, if that part of the brain is still developing, even if they have good intentions, there's still a possibility for them to make an impulsive choice to put a picture that they are going to regret later on. Whereas if they were 30, I'm not putting that picture on. Are you kidding
Hmm.
me? That's crazy. What was I thinking? We all make mistakes, don't get me
Yeah.
wrong. But that teenage brain, absolutely. And so what can happen is things will happen without recognizing the consequence until afterwards. And that's when the issue comes into play, where that can then definitely reinforce that negative emotion, that negative, all the different feelings that a person's dealing with, which then reinforces that anxiety, that social anxiety, especially if after that, now they're being cyberbullied. Now it's, hey, look, your stupid video you made. You're now on YouTube and you've had 1 million hits. Great.
Hmm.
You know,
Yes. I get that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So how does this, if like, okay, you've answered that. You've answered that. Like, how does it factor in with social anxiety? You mentioned how it all comes down to that. So you must be familiar. Are you familiar with the term FOMO, the fear of missing out?
Yeah, I looked it up because when you said that, the fact, I was like, oh, well, there we go. I finally figured out LOL, a year or two ago, you know. But I was like, oh, sure, what's this? So I looked up the
Okay.
Urban Dictionary. I'm like, oh, fear, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, from a young person, even old, even taking the age thing out, there's always a sense of wanting some form of relationship. We are wired, we are created for relationship. And social media creates, again, kind of like when I talked about that secondary versus primary emotion, it's almost like a secondary relationship. It's not a primary relationship. So it could very easily, I could see how that would lead into an ongoing sense of fear of missing out.
Mm-hmm.
What a terrible way to live. Rather than going, you know what, I choose not to go to that because I'm tired or I have homework or I just actually am choosing not to go there because that's actually not a good social influence on my life. I'm choosing other directions. I need some my own healthy isolation time. But instead, I have to go to that party. If I miss out, I'm not cool. I'm not popular. Oh, look, everyone else was there and I wasn't invited. Hmm, that's not healthy at all. So absolutely it does.
Yes. Okay. And how closely do you think this feeling is linked to social anxiety? Do you feel the excessive use of social media exacerbates these feelings of missing out?
Yeah, again, it's a neutral. It's going to depend on the individual. If
All
they're
right.
already dealing with that, it just reinforces it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely there's enough social media has proven to be enough of an influence that even those who say they don't deal with it, how come you're still on your phone? So can you get off? Can you get off for even a day without being on social media? So that's kind of the litmus test, I call it.
Yes.
A lot of times January is a time where a lot of people even within different religions will take a time of fasting. And my thing is this: when was the last time you fasted from social media for even 24 hours? If you can't deal with it, if you can't be on your phone for even more than 2, 3 hours, you got a problem.
Of course.
So that's affecting your life. It is a direct influence on your life.
Yes. That's true. That's true. Do you believe that excessive social media usage and consumption causes young people to fixate and dwell over the amount of engagement, for instance, likes, shares, and comments that their posts receive? Do they
Yeah.
dwell on them a lot?
Again, developmentally, especially for anyone 24 years or under,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And if they've been in that culture and now they're 25, 26, it's just part of their life now. And if it
Mm-hmm.
hasn't been dealt with, absolutely, it continues to reinforce that because that's now just part of a pattern. And that's the challenge that we're going to face. It's kind of my polite way of saying thanks social media, I still have a job for the next 20 years, because there's going to be some long-term emotional ramifications that I get to deal with and other therapists, with all of what's happening with what we're talking about today.
Yes, of course, of course. How is the individual's ability to focus or concentrate affected by FOMO and excessive social media usage?
Hmm. Gonna have to say that again.
Yeah, of course. Like, how is an individual's ability to focus and concentrate affected by the fear of missing out and excessive social media usage?
Oh yeah, sure. Because yeah, that makes sense now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does affect it in the way that all of that energy is being utilized towards on something that is a surface, or if we want to call it a secondary emotion, rather than focusing on themselves and finding things that are actually effective, that work well with them, that help them grow, lead them to maturity. And without that, you're just left with a very shallow life, and how you're living. So it absolutely affects it that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. There is also a theory of a dopamine effect that a person receives every time the social media post gets a form of engagement. How accurate do you think that is?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I believe it.
Yeah.
Dopamine, the receptor, it's a pleasure center,
Uh-huh.
and that's the issue. Again, going from a developmental perspective, specifically the teenage years. that part, which is all emotional base, is connected to the dopamine area. Okay. And so with that, it's a constant reinforcement of pleasure, 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 pleasure. And at the end of the day, if I don't have that, that's actually where addiction comes from. If you look at studies with like cocaine addicts,
Mm-hmm.
that dopamine is just to the roof. And that's why when a person's coming off an addiction like cocaine, um, yeah, like that. That's where
Yeah.
you get really grumpy. You have no emotional control because you're just having, it's just harder to maintain that because you don't have a coping skill. Whereas all my pain and hurts are coped with a shallow secondary device known as social media. It's interesting that one of my older, oh gosh, I'm going like 15 years ago or whatever.
Oh, wow.
I've got one of my favorite pictures that I have is one half you have the brain that has a picture of someone on cocaine. And then you have someone else on this side, the picture with someone who has an addiction to pornography. They look the same because those dopamine centers are skyrocketed to the max. And whether it's pornography, whether it's a social media, just eye candy, whatever you want to call it, we're going to start seeing more and more of that effect. And if you take that away, oh, what do? You have no grasp. And if you're already dealing with social anxiety, if you're dealing with traumas, hurts, past pain, add on top of it the social media, that is a huge cocktail of scariness. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yes, no, that's very accurate. And like you've sort of answered my next question as well, which was like, how does this affect them emotionally, the people who are going through this?
Yeah,
This like,
yeah,
if they when they don't receive the amount of engagement that they expect, what effect does that happen? And so
yeah.
you've answered that. So
Yeah. And I'll
yes,
just add to that
yeah,
specifically.
of
If
course.
they continue with that, if they do not have a way to cope with their anxiety or whatever they're dealing with,
Hmm.
all the social media will do is reinforce that self negative belief within them at their core being, which means they just keep going around this vicious cycle over and over again.
Yes, of course, of course. Do you think that the fear of rejection, being left behind or forgotten, is stronger now more than ever because of the excessive usage and prevalence of social media?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's because, yeah, it's because it's a false sense of community connection.
Yes, yes,
And so out of that, I may not have had that as much in the 70s or 80s because I'm with people, I'm not with people, whereas this, you're always with people, but it's a
exactly.
secondary I'm with people, not a primary face to face. This is a secondary communication. Although we're communicating,
Yes,
I still am not with you. I'm not sensing. I'm not, not to be graphic, but we're not smelling each other. We're not, all that kind of stuff. I don't the environment,
yeah,
that kind of thing. The screen you're seeing is my roof. You're not seeing the rest of my, my little office area,
yeah,
that kind of stuff.
yeah, of
That
course.
changes perception and everything with that.
It
So
does.
yes.
Of course, of course. So sitting behind a screen can offer a sense or feeling of safety to an individual with social anxiety, giving them the confidence to express themselves better. Do you agree with this statement and why?
Hmm.
Like sitting behind the screen, offering a sense of security, and it sort of boosts their confidence somehow. Do you agree
Yeah.
with that, or do
I
you?
would say from a therapeutic perspective,
Hmm.
my observation has been that, again, social media from a neutral perspective, not saying it's right or wrong,
Uh-huh.
just because we talked a lot about consequences. But if someone is dealing with legitimate social anxiety, this very well could be a way to begin breaking those barriers down if it's used intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, with a purpose to be able to then deal with, from going back to the first question, as far as social anxiety being with people, that anxiousness, this could be that next step towards. So this is more of a environmental connection that we're having, but then that actual next step, if I were to drive up to Edmonton and meet you and have a physical social interaction, that's a whole nother level. Here, I don't have to worry about it. I can make
Yeah.
faces at you. And well, I mean, you know where I work, but beyond that, it's like I'm not worried about it. I
Yeah,
may never hear of you or see you again after this. So,
of course. Yeah,
so that takes that fear away in some regards.
that's true.
That can be again a good and bad thing,
Yeah.
you know. But yes, and in some regards, there are certain therapies as well that will actually use a lot of visualization process. So, for example, if I'm dealing with someone with trauma, oftentimes I'll use certain techniques where they're visualizing themselves behind, let's say, like a glass screen door. See your event. It's too much for them to handle. Well, let's put a barrier up in front of you. It's a glass window. It's bulletproof. No one's going to harm you. Now they're able to then safely tell what that trauma was and process it through, as one example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so absolutely, I could see that being utilized with intention for good.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair.